today's world, in just, half a decade, normality has really gone out the window for a lot of different reasons. Part of it is technological, and part of it is just a total breakdown in the global systems of governance and national political systems and everything. But a few of the things I pointed out in the Substack were the Houthis didn't used to have long-range missiles, especially hypersonic missiles, that can strike deep in Israel, but now they do. They just launched one that they said was hypersonic, and it blew up in Israel. Israel, meanwhile, did not have the ability to make cell phones and pagers and things just blow up remotely, but they just showed that they have the ability to do that by wounding several thousand Hezbollah members and killing a bunch of them too. So now you basically got a new war front for Israel, where Hezbollah is retaliating for the attack on their communication system, and Israel is striking deep into Lebanon. The fact that you can blow up electronic devices remotely is something that's very new and very destabilizing. Presidential assassination attempts were maybe a once in every decade or several decade thing. And we've had two in just the last few weeks here in the US. And, it doesn't seem like the Secret Service protection that's being afforded to candidates like Trump and Kennedy is adequate at all. And it looks like, in a lot of cases, either grossly incompetent or purposefully incompetent, one or the other. And that's a very scary thing, because you can't have multiple assassination attempts, one of which eventually is going to be successful, on presidential candidates in major countries. If you want to be considered a real democracy, you don't murder or imprison the people who run against the powers that be, and that's where we are right now. So anyhow, you add it all up. There are other things too, but add those things up. And we're in a world that's very different from the relatively predictable one of 5 years ago. And this one is just unpredictable. The Ukrainians didn't used to have missiles that can strike deep into Russia and the latest one that hit caused what the UPI said was an earthquake level explosion. So now you've got NATO weapons striking deep into Russia and causing massive implosions. The picture of it looks like a mushroom cloud. So we're in a really dangerous place, and it really has a spinning out of control kind of vibe to it. And this is kind of pre-World War I, where everything seemed okay, and then all of a sudden one thing happened and another thing happened, and everybody got sucked into some gigantic war that they had no intention of being involved in a year before. And we're kind of there right now, where Russia is seeing its citizens be killed and its infrastructure will be broken up by NATO weapons. So what is it going to do to retaliate? It certainly has the ability to do so. And the neocons running the US government are kind of hoping that'll be the case, because they think they can win a nuclear war against Russia. And this is all happening during a presidential campaign when the sitting president is a dementia patient who has no control over what his government is doing. The vice president is running a campaign where, to the extent that she's in front of people at all, she's traveling around, to do canned interviews and things like that. So there's basically nobody that we can point to who's running the government, which means the people who are running the government, as we drift into World War III, are those shadowy figures who actually want World War III. They're unaccountable. We can't vote them out of office because we don't even really know who they are in many cases. Yeah, this is a very scary time. And it's one in which it's very hard to invest accordingly. Like, what exactly do you want to own to get out in front of this? Obviously, gold and silver. Everything comes back to precious metals and has for the last 20 or 30 years, because those are the kinds of money that will replace the failing fiat currencies. So whatever kind of geopolitical craziness happens, whatever kind of crazy monetary policy that happens going forward, and you want to be in real money, because the stuff that I just mentioned, all the crazy geopolitical stuff that's happening, is coinciding with a failure of the world's fiat currencies. So in those kind of complicated times, you want as much certainty as possible. And I think for most people, that's a distant hope. And that's a very common strategy for an incompetent government. They screw up their domestic situation, and then they start looking abroad for an enemy that they can use to scare their population into not paying attention to the mess that's been created by the government. I think you could see the last decade, at least since the 2016 election, as one thing after another designed to spook the populace into not paying attention to the mess that the aristocracy has created here. I think the pandemic could be seen as a manufactured crisis designed to make people malleable. Even if it was just an experiment to see how easy it is to do that, turns out it's pretty easy. I mean, half the population in the US totally bought the pandemic scam and were willing to do and put up with authoritarian policies that under no circumstances are constitutional, because they were so terrified of, I'm not going to say a made-up disease on YouTube, because that would get you in trouble, but something that wasn't nearly as serious in retrospect as they made it out to be early on. And why did they do that? The pandemic ends and the Ukraine war starts. And, we've got a new Hitler out there, but the battle is on the border of the new Hitler's country. It's nowhere near us. It involves us in exactly zero ways, except that we would like to induct the Ukraine into NATO, which is an anti-Russia military coalition. So we want basically a missile base on the border of Russia, and they're not having any of that, obviously. Go back and look up the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's the exact same situation in reverse, where Russia was trying to put missiles in Cuba, and we were willing to fight World War III to prevent that. We're in the same situation now, except it's Russia who wants defensible borders and us who's trying to take that away from them. So there are several geopolitical objectives here, probably. One is we want Russia's resources because they have a lot of oil and they've got a lot of everything else, including uranium. So they're an energy powerhouse and they own a lot of gold and they have a lot of gold mines. So it's in the interest of the US neocons who want the US to rule the world for the next 1,000 years to take over as many big resource-rich areas as possible. And they see Russia as a candidate for that. If we can just destabilize Russia's government and then go in and take control of the next government and make them a puppet state, then we get all those resources, So they see that as a goal. And another goal is basically just to remove a big competitor from the global chessboard. And the third is to spook the populace into obeying. You can have an action that has multiple objectives. And I think in this case, there are several things that the aristocracy hopes to get out of starting a war with Russia. It's those three things and maybe a few more. And risking World War III with a nuclear power for any of those things. I mean, yeah, Russia has a lot of oil, but oil is a fungible commodity. It has to be sold on the open market in order to have any value. And then price of oil is just what it is, no matter who's selling it. I don't think it benefits us really in any way economically. And of course it benefits us a little bit militarily if Russia is weaker because it doesn't have the oil to sell, but not at the cost of a nuclear war. It's getting harder and harder to put together a coherent plan to gain resilience during what's coming, because what's coming is more and more unpredictable. We could wake up any morning right now and find out that some hypersonic missile fired from some country that isn't us has hit another country that's not us. And now there's a war going that we have to be involved in one way or another because we have an alliance with somebody. And, that's the kind of thing you wake up. This is happening overnight while we're asleep. We wake up in the morning and we're in World War III. Very scary situation. And, the only real obvious conclusion is that the prepping that we've been doing probably needs to be turbocharged. Now, we need to accelerate whatever plans we had, if it's for water storage or to get that garden going so you're 50% food self-sufficient, or to stack those silver coins so you've got a sufficient number, however you define sufficient. If you're not there for any of those things, it might be time to take on a new sense of urgency and really get going with it. There's a couple of ways of looking at a big move on the part of the Fed. And one is that they're panicking because what they see is much worse than what we see. Let's say that's possible. They're seeing consumer spending numbers and employment numbers into the future based on their models that are a lot less favorable than what we've seen in the last year. Because, realistically, in the last year, the government has lied about a lot of this stuff. If the true numbers come out eventually, and they do have to, maybe they're going to be a lot worse than a lot of people think. And the Fed wants to get out ahead of that with easy money. That's possible. One other possibility is that it's an election year. The Fed works for the government. It's owned by the big banks. So they want to keep incumbents in power because the incumbents are the ones who appoint Fed governors. And those guys would like to keep their jobs. So they're doing that. They're having easy interest rates or lower interest rates leading to higher financial asset prices just as people are making up their minds about who to vote for. So that's possible. Oh, that's kind of late for that. They probably should have done that 6 months ago if they actually wanted people to have an embedded sense of well-being about the economy, because I think it's kind of late. Most people have already formed an opinion that the economy is not good, cost of living is too high. It was better 4 years ago. So the third possibility is that central banks like lower interest rates, and they may have felt that they kept interest rates as high as they could for as long as they could, and it was going to get disruptive politically and financially if they keep them higher, even in the face of the stock market rocketing and house prices being unaffordable for 70% of the population, and the unemployment rate, it's 4 point something, right? It's very low. Back in my day when I was growing up, 6% unemployment was a pretty good unemployment rate, and now 4% or so is considered the highest acceptable. And then we have to ease when it gets to that level. So it could have been any of those explanations. And it really doesn't matter in the big picture, because the world is being forced to use excessively easy money in order to manage all the debts that we've taken on. You can't have tens or hundreds of trillions of dollars of debt, depending on which country that we're talking about, because normal interest rates mean a rising and debilitating cost of interest on the debt that you've got out there. So your interest rates can go up for a little while if they need to go up in order to stabilize some aspect of the economy, but they have to come right back down, because otherwise the interest cost eats governments and corporations, and to an extent individuals alive. It destroys the economy by making a growing number of entities insolvent. So we always had to have lower interest rates again, and maybe this is just when it has to start happening, because they've run out of what they consider to be runway, with higher interest rates. Whatever the cause, interest rates going back down from here carry with them some pretty serious risks. And one is that we found out what extremely easy money does during the pandemic when we increased the money supply dramatically. And in 2022, we got double-digit inflation, almost, according to the official numbers in the US. And in real terms, most legitimate estimates of inflation have it at 12 to 15% in that year. And that's destabilizing. When people see their cost of living go up by a third in the space of 3 or 4 years, something called the trust horizon just shrinks down to nothing. In other words, people just give up on the government because they feel like they've been screwed over by policymakers, because their lives got so much harder. And then they become unmanageable. You get a populace that's basically ungovernable at that point. And we did that once. And people know it can happen because it happened in recent memory. So when the government starts lowering interest rates again, and they're going to have to, they're going to have to get back down close to zero in this cycle. When they do that, it's liable to ignite inflation again. But this time around, people won't be surprised by it. They'll be prepared for it because it just happened, and they're not going to let it happen again. So, if we thought the hoarding that happened, for instance, in 2022 and 23 was bizarre, wait till you see what happens this time around. As soon as inflation ticks back up to 5 or 6%, which it will do if we keep borrowing $2 trillion a year and having to pay interest on that while we're cutting interest rates for everything else. If that happens, then you really risk the system spinning out of control, because higher inflation becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy via inflationary expectations. And that's what you risk when you keep interest rates too low for too long, run deficits that are way too high for the state of the economy, and just generally encourage more debt to be taken on. So we're creating that risk, and we're creating it in the not too distant future, because already, if interest rates drop by, say, 100 basis points, in other words, 1 percentage point, we're already getting back into historically low interest rate territory, because interest rates right now are not historically high. They're actually kind of normal. But you can't have normal interest rates without causing a crisis. So we have to get back down to unnaturally low interest rates. I think the 100 basis point cut by the end of the year that a lot of people are talking about is completely possible, and then more in the year after that. And I think at some point it starts to be destabilizing, and then there's no tool left to fix it, because our debt will be that much higher, which means our interest costs will be that much higher if we try to raise interest rates again. So once people figure out that the Fed has no tools left with which to fix a destabilizing currency system, that's when everything blows up. And it's completely possible that it happens in the short rather than long run. In the near term, it's impossible to predict where any market goes. And so in the next 6 months or so, for gold and silver, they could spike from here, or they could get smacked. If we have a recession that turns into an equities bear market, then that'll be bad for gold and silver in the short run. There's always the chance that gold goes up because everybody's so worried, but historically, gold and silver get whacked when equities get whacked for a fairly straightforward reason. When you're getting margin calls on your tech stocks and all of a sudden you're in danger of your brokerage account just closing you out because your equities are going down so far so fast, you got to sell things that haven't gone down very far and very fast yet, and that may be gold at that point. So your gold is holding up, and that's what you sell. So then you get a gold bear market, or at least a flash crash. But there's some big wins at the back of the gold market right now, and the biggest is central bank buying. They see this stuff coming, and they don't expect U.S. Treasury bonds to be good stores of value over time if the US dollar is going to be a victim of the next financial/currency crisis. So they're cashing out their treasury bonds and they're buying gold because they assume gold is going to hold its value better in the long run than a currency that's being inflated away by its government. So, and you've seen the central banks of the world buy 1,000 tons of gold in each of the last 2 years, which is a big number in a market where the mines of the world produce maybe 4,000 tons. That's a huge new buyer coming into the market. So let that continue. And that's kind of puts a floor under the price of gold, since the central banks seem to be non-price sensitive right now. If it goes down, they'll buy some. If it goes up, they'll buy some, whatever. And that's a good thing for gold. Another good thing for gold is that you're seeing increasing buying of ETFs, which means that investors are starting to buy via GLD, and but there are other gold ETFs that are seeing inflows too. And that's another very positive thing, because that gives you a pretty wide-ranging group of people out there between central banks and high net worth individuals and regular people buying ETFs who all getting on board with gold right now. And so I think if there's a flash crash, it'll be a V bottom like we saw in 2008 and 2022, where, precious metals tank along with everything else, but then they take off when central banks respond to an equities bear market with much easier money. So that's probably the worst case scenario for gold, is that you have a V bottom flash crash, which then turns into the next leg of the bull market.